few weeks ago I went to a bar. A few of my friends are bouncers, so I go and hang out with them. And I decided to go sit on this back patio they have and smoke a cigarette. And it's pretty late, so I'm assuming that most of the people that are out are pretty drunk. So much to my surprise, this kid comes out and asks me if he could bum a cigarette. And I ask him what his favorite color is. He says blue. And I ask him if he was a crayon, what color would he be? And he asks me, why is it that I'm giving him a pop quiz when all he wanted was a cigarette? And I replied with, if he wanted a cigarette, he should answer the questions, and hopefully he would answer them in ways that I found to be suitable, or he wasn't going to get a cigarette. And so he told me that if he was a crayon, he would be forest green. And I told him that was a really terrible answer. Then I asked him if he was a state quarter, what state he would be. And he said New York. Because you live in New York, I then asked him, and he said yes. And I told him that was an increasingly terrible answer. But onward we proceeded. And I asked him if he was a Pop-Tart, what flavor would he be? And he first said he would be strawberry, and then changed his answer to s'mores. He seems very contented on s'mores. And I told him that I was glad that he changed his answer, because I hate strawberry by default, because I'm allergic to them. Then I asked him if he was an animal reincarnated in the next life, what animal would be? Dog, he says. And I told him about this book that I had read in a class last semester about a collection of authors who had written about dogs, because dogs are all over literature. Like Kafka had this dog that he thought was trying to kill him, and some French author, I think, had this dog that she thought, or he thought, was trying to commit suicide because it jumped out of a window. And I told him he might like it, but he probably wouldn't if he didn't like to read. And he said he did like to read, and I commended him for that. And so finally I asked him if he was a tree, what kind of a tree he would be, and he told me he'd be a weeping willow. And I liked that answer, because I would be a weeping willow too. So I gave him a cigarette, even though his answers were subpar, because he was being nice. And he sat down, and he told me his name was Jeff, and I told him my name was Maria. And he asked me where I go to college, and I told him. And then I asked him where he went. He said he goes to Siena, and he was a poli-sci major. Where did you go to high school, he then asked me. Or where did you go to high school? And I told him I went to Saratoga. Oh, what year, he says? '07. And he said it was funny that we'd never met, because he graduated in '07 too. And I told him I sort of tried to keep to myself. I was kind of the girl that no one really knew, walking around in short skirts and listening to punk music. He said he didn't like punk music, but there was nothing wrong with being your own person. And I agreed, because what's the point otherwise? And he said that he had issues keeping to himself. He was always kind of one of those people who was dragged out with everyone else. So we continued to talk about school mostly, and the commute, how terrible it is driving 45 minutes from Saratoga to the Albany area. And he told me I was a really cool person, and I agreed that he was a really cool person. And he asked me if I wanted to have a drink sometime, and we exchanged numbers. And so he left, and maybe 10 minutes later, he sent me a text and said that I should come in and have a drink. And I told him I was going home, but what if we went to get coffee sometime? And he replied with, he didn't want to get coffee because he was seeing someone, and he didn't want to complicate that. And I asked him what the difference was about getting coffee or getting a drink. And he said coffee seemed more like a date, whereas we were just having a conversation and, you know, continuing the conversation with drinks. And I then told him about how I was doing this project for school where I was trying to buy friends, and that I really wasn't interested in anything else other than his possible friendship. And he reiterated that he didn't want to complicate things, so I let it go. So a week ago, I was taking pictures in downtown Albany for this photojournalism class that I'm taking. And as I'm getting out of my car and putting my lens on my camera and whatnot, the project was to walk around and find a story somewhere. This boy with red hair, who's carrying notebooks, comes up to me. And I was near St. Rose, so I figured he was a St. Rose student. And he asks me if I'm a photographer. And I tell him any asshole with a camera thinks they're a photographer. And that I was taking a photojournalism class. And the class kind of made me be a photographer, whether I wanted to be or not. He then asked me what high school I go to. And I told him I went to UAlbany. And he said he sometimes went to St. Rose. I then proceeded to ask him what it means to sometimes go to St. Rose. And he says, well, when he gets up and then, takes a shower and decides whether or not he's gonna go to class, he usually just decides to walk around downtown. But he takes his books anyway, just in case he decides to go to class. And so I asked him if he would take me through a typical day in the life. And he said, sure. So he then asked me if I wanted to get a cup of coffee, and I said it'd be kind of hard to carry a cup of coffee and take pictures of him going through his typical day in the life, and he laughed and said that was true. But we went into the Dunkin' Donuts on Madison anyway, and he got a cup of coffee, and it was funny because everyone knew who he was, so he didn't have to pay. And he told me that it was really easy to make friends with the people in Albany, especially when you're just bumming around and not doing anything. And that every day, whenever he saw someone smoking, he would ask them for a cigarette. And then I told him that when people ask me for cigarettes, I just ask them a bunch of weird questions. And so I followed him around for the day, and he babbled on about how I should be listening to all these really great bands, like Glassjaw and, I don't know, other mainstream sorts of bands that I really wasn't interested in. And I sort of nodded along. And he told me if I'm ever hanging around in Albany sometime, that I'd probably see him, and we should hang out sometime. And I said that I might. But I don't plan on ever really hanging out with him. Mostly because he kind of just seemed like we had nothing in common. And I did try to buy his coffee, and they wouldn't let me. So he couldn't be bought either. A couple days ago, I was sitting in the campus center, and this girl comes up to me. And she asked me if I was in her psychology class. And I told her I wasn't sure because my psychology class is this lecture of over 300 people, and it's really hard to keep track of all of them. And she described her class, which was a lecture of 300 people and such, at the same time, the same professor. So I assumed we were in the same class. Then she asked me if he had the test this week or next week, and I told her it was next Wednesday, not this past week. And she was just like, okay, cool, because I thought I missed it. And she told me her name was Alex, and I told her my name was Ashley. I don't really know why I told her my name was Ashley. It just sort of happened that way. And she asked me why I was drinking hot coffee, and she told me she only liked iced coffee. And I told her that I preferred hot coffee. And so she kind of gave me a weird look on that one, but let it slide. And we were talking about our majors. She was a psychology major, and I'm an English major. And she asked me why I was taking a psychology class if I'm an English major. And I told her that psychology electives were usually more interesting than other ones because the mind is sort of interesting, although somewhat frustrating. And she asked how the mind was frustrating. And I told her it wasn't really the mind that was frustrating. It was the way that psychology classes were taught because, all of it's up for speculation. And I suppose that's where the content comes from. And she agreed that was where the context comes from. And I asked her if maybe she wanted to get iced coffee sometime. And then her friends sat down, and she stopped talking to me. So a few weeks ago, back when it was like 80 degrees out, I was walking around downtown Saratoga. And I saw this really cute dog. I'm not really sure what kind of a dog. It was like a sort of a Siberian husky-looking type dog tied to a tree. And I noticed that it had no water. And so I thought, what kind of an asshole would tie a dog to a tree and not give him any water? And I hope whoever this person is going into the coffee shop to get the dog some water. But in the meantime, I decided to sit down with the dog and time exactly 5 minutes. And if no one had brought the dog water in that amount of time, then I would go get the dog some water. Sure enough, like 2 minutes later, this really attractive guy comes out holding a cup of water. And he has a smile on his face, and he says, oh, looks like she's making friends again. And I said, oh, is this your dog? What's her name? And he said, her name's Shiva, and it's not my dog. It's my roommate's dog. And I said, oh, well, it's an adorable dog. And he said, yeah, she makes friends everywhere. I thought it'd be fun to take her for a run, but it turns out it's not. And I said, is it because she's making friends? And he said, no, it's because she can't keep up. And I told him that was unfortunate.